She wore a life like a couture gown, everything cut to measure, every seam invisible, every surface polished until light slid off it without leaving a fingerprint. The penthouse at sunrise was a room of deliberate reflections, mirrored walls, a chandelier like frozen constellations, the pale marble of counters that did not tolerate fingerprints. Ivy Sterling moved through it with an ease that rehearsed itself every morning for a decade. She knew how to make her reflection look steady, how to tilt her chin so no one could guess the small hollowness beneath the silk. That morning, for the first time in a long while, the mirror gave her something unexpected. A question that had nothing to do with couture or charity galas. As she smoothed the lapel of a jacket she had not yet worn, she thought not of appearance, but of the sound that had lodged behind her ribs since Zurich. A low, steady hum like an engine at rest, and like nothing mechanical she had ever heard. It coursed through memory like an undertow. It did not belong to her, and somehow it had begun to become a part of her mornings. She could have ignored it. Ivy had been raised to ignore the small internal weather, to convert unease into calendar entries, to resolve fissures with practical gestures, a dinner, a donation, a change of address. But there are certain shifts that arrive soft as frost, and then move across the skin as if they own the body. She touched the hollow at her throat and felt an impulse that felt unspeakably like answering. Zurich had seemed a comfortable set of predictable rhythms, lacquered tables, a charity auction that smelled of citrus and faux heroics, cameras that fed light like an offering. Ivy had been performing generosity, the right laugh at the right moment. A check discreetly slid into an envelope. He came toward her like a question she had not asked. He appeared from a galleried stairwell at the moment she paused to observe the chandelier. There was a quiet in his arrival, a way of occupying space that did not demand applause. Alexander Vale looked at first glance like a man who belonged in the second act of a play. A suit cut with absolute certainty, hands that did not fidget, a posture that suggested one had never been surprised. But it was his face that unsettled anyone who spent too long looking. His eyes were storm gray, as if the weather had been folded into them and kept. They held a distance that was unmistakable and somehow not hostile. When he spoke to Ivy, it was with an economy of words that made each syllable count. When he listened as if cataloging light. Natural curiosity, Ivy told herself. Another man used to the company of the present and not the past. But there were small dissonances she noticed, and then, for social reasons, and because it was easier, dismissed. The faint chill he wore as if it were an accessory. His apparent indifference to the plates passed around him, the way he never seemed to reach for a glass. A hand that, when she had brushed it in conversation, had felt improbably cool. Once, in a moment of private bravado, she had asked if he was cold. He had smiled in a way that acknowledged the question without answering it, and his voice had descended to a note that hummed in her chest long after he left. She told herself she had fallen for the idea of him rather than the man, as one tells oneself about a risky purchase. It was convenient, neat. She liked the sensation of mystery. It made her muscles uncoil. She liked that he could not be acquired by conventional means, that he was not the sort of prize she could buy and display on a shelf. But the attraction was not theatrical. It tasted of something deeper, a salvage of something that had been smoothed away by years of social engineering. They met again, because in Ivy's world, meetings had a logic of their own. Milan, a small restaurant that smelled of garlic and lemon, and the kind of candlelight that made people confess minor sins. A private viewing in a gallery where the paintings seemed indifferent to visitors. In each place he was the same and not the same. Attentive, precise, and punctuated by odd abstentions. He did not taste meals the way others did. He did not grow weary. Once, in an elevator between floors, Ivy pressed her palm to his wrist as a joke to feel his pulse. There was none. She felt the absence like a missed beat in music. Not the absence of life exactly, but the absence of one particular measure that others used to map the passing of days. She could have stopped seeing him then. Could have concluded that this was a man whose company could be admired from a distance like a sculpture. Instead, she found herself telling him things she had not told even her closest friends. The small betrayals of a woman who had been taught to perform contentment. The echo of childhood solitude even in a house that hosted 50 guests on alternate Saturdays. He listened with a patience that did not require reciprocity, and that steadiness, oddly, was what she was missing. Their courtship unfolded in the slantwise motion of the globe Ivy inhabited. They were seen together at fundraisers in Manhattan, where she introduced him with a careful smile and a sentence that made his name sound like an accessory. They were photographed walking the old stone lanes of an Italian hill town, where she let him guide her through alleys she had never known. They sat on the roof of a hotel in Singapore, a quiet constellation of neon around them, and she watched him look at the stars with a face that did not register wonder, but rather the careful noting of coordinates. And then the proposal on a Scottish cliff came like punctuation. The wind there was hard enough to bruise the skin, and the sea below threw itself against the stone in a kind of fury that seemed pleased to have an audience. He stood behind her and said simply, "I have wanted this." He took her ring with a hand steady as sculpture and placed it on her finger. She said yes before she understood precisely the cost, because the act itself, to choose, to be chosen, had become rarer than any jewel. There are many kinds of promises. Some glitter under chandeliers. Others etch themselves into the skeleton of a life. Ivy believed, as those who have always been given everything tend to believe, that any future discomforts could be managed with the right team, the right doctors, the right public relations. Love would help, she supposed. Compromise would follow. There was arrogance in her belief that things could always be negotiated. Wedding preparations folded into the life of the Sterling household with the smooth inevitability of a well-planned calendar. Silk swatches, a guest list that read like a small ledger of taste. Her mother, who had the face of someone who never allowed an eyelash to escape design, tasted every plan for flaws and asked the one question Ivy had allowed to pass by like a fleeting cloud. "Do you trust him?" It was not malicious. It was the question of someone who had invested decades in arranging heirs and alliances. Ivy considered the phrase. Trust. It had always been a commodity she traded in with care. She had trusted the bank that held the family fortune, the trustees who preserved the name, the charities that polished the legacy. She had not had to trust a man in the bones, not truly. Her answer was the answer of someone who had practiced agency in a world that approved of her choices. Yes, the ceremony was set in a cathedral of stone, where stained glass filtered light into petals, and the air smelled of beeswax and cold stone. Guests arrived like ornaments, their faces cultivated for the right expression. The hush before the bride's entrance was a curated silence. Cameras were held like votive offerings. When Ivy walked down the aisle, every reflection in the polished floor multiplied her like a fleet forming. She found Alexander at the altar, hands folded in a pose she had seen on statues. His suit was the color of later storms, and his eyes when they met hers were all the earlier evenings combined. Vows were promises spoken into the architecture of the city. The officiant's voice slid over phrases she had rehearsed. When it came to Alexander's part, his words were economical and true in a way that made the world tighten. "Ivy Sterling," he said, and the cathedral seemed to hold its breath. "I bind myself to you." It was the word that shifted the air. It sounded archaic and modern at once, speech that could be both legal and elemental. Some guests smiled at the archaic cadence. Ivy felt, with a clarity that was almost physical, the first tug of something she could not name. There was a low subterranean vibration in the stones. Candles shivered. The flame of half a dozen guttering tapers dipped as if in salute. On the stained glass, the image of a saint seemed to blur for a breath, as if time itself hesitated. He did not offer an explanation. He did not have to. When questions rose in the faces of those who watched, Ivy met them and found them unhelpful. She had always been a woman who preferred to understand things immediately, to fold uncertainty flat. But here, understanding escaped her like smoke. After the ceremony, amid the glittering reception and the orchestral strain, the anomalies multiplied but remained subtle, almost ornamental, the way a strange jeweler might hide an odd stone in a familiar setting, so no one worries about it. Alexander declined the banquet with a small, inscrutable smile. In the privacy of a second-floor balcony, he placed his hand over Ivy's and did not release it. The hum she had first noticed in that penthouse morning felt closer than breath. It vibrated through his palm into hers as if he carried a current, and she was, for reasons she couldn't quite articulate, the conduit. "Do you—" she began, wanting to articulate the fear, the curiosity. Words felt clumsy beside the sound of the sea of applause rising below. He looked at her the way he always did when she permitted herself to be seen closely, and in that look she found a kind of pity and a kind of longing that made her chest ache. "I will not hide from you," he said. "Not here." There are manners of speech that are both confession and boundary. Ivy did not ask him if he was human. The people who asked such questions in real life wanted a category they could pin and frame. She wanted more than a label. She wanted to understand what this meant for the shape of her days, the small choices, the late-night hollowness after the guest list was folded back into envelopes, the way she would navigate love when love came draped in otherness. In the days that followed, the honeymoon that everyone expected to be a swift interlude between society pages and summer concerts, Ivy discovered the first, quiet mechanics of the thing that had been bound to her name. They left the city under the pretense of a private tour of estates in Scotland, a journey that was part cinematograph and part real desire. The cottage Alexander arranged for them was not ostentatious. It was all gray stone and beamed ceilings, a place where the wind wrote fresh patterns along the panes and the curtains floated like questions. At first, the changes were small and could be mistaken for jet lag or champagne. Ivy woke with the faint impression of minutes crowded together, as if someone had pushed them into a corner of her body. A hairline that had been invisible at 25 appeared like silk at 27. A laugh line formed at the angle of her mouth, barely noticeable but present. When she confessed the oddities to Alexander, her voice a careful instrument, he did not respond with the certainty of a physician. He answered with the gravity of someone who had been watching the long pieces of other people's lives from outside a theater. "It takes from you," he said finally, not in accusation but in the blunt architecture of fact. "Not in a single day, not in a single hour, but in inches and in lines, in the way light holds your skin. Part of me needs measure in the world. Measure is what anchors me. The only way I can be is to exist within an equilibrium. For a time, you were the measure I fit against." She thought she would feel betrayed, or used, or incandescent with rage. Instead, she felt the particular ache of someone who had learned to count her life as a string of deliverables, and discovered a presence insisting her days contained a different currency. There was, in his words, an honesty that felt at once cruel and respectful. He named the mechanism without romanticizing it. He did not say he loved her as if love could be an answer that canceled a cost. He said simply that he needed balance, and that balance had been found, at least partly, in her. There is a difference between being told a truth and feeling it unspool inside you. Ivy's reaction was a careful, complex thing. She had agency. She had lived by choices. She was not a woman who easily gave up herself without negotiation. Yet the intimacy of his confession, the way he handed her causality like a delicate, dangerous object, forced her to move through a calculus that no consultant could parse for her. She could, she realized, accept the arrangement. Many would. The life she had was a tapestry of comforts and influence. It would be possible, with money and the right people, to slow the erosion for a time. She could make the choice to share herself as payment and live in a strange kind of abundance. Or she could refuse this architecture and insist that the cost not be paid in the currency of her days. The world would not like that decision. People did not often admire women who turned down immortality by other means. Her mother might be affronted. Her public image might suffer. But those were considerations of image. The matter that coursed through her veins now was of a different nature. In the golden hour after the first evening in the cottage, they sat opposite one another at a table with no place for a third opinion. Alexander's face in the lamplight was not softer. It was simply present, as if he had always been this way, and had chosen only now to reveal it. Ivy thought about the life she had built to avoid dependence, and how, paradoxically, dependence had arrived not as request, but as binding. "What do you ask of me?" she asked, in the only way she knew how, with a directness that had always placed her at an advantage in negotiations. He named the cost plainly. He named the measure. He called it, in a word that had the intimacy of a signature, a tether. He did not attempt to dress the concept in romantic metaphors or legalese. The tether was an economics of existence. It was a balancing of being. Where he lacked temporality in the human sense, where his presence had been a kind of exhale outside the clock, the tether hinged his being to the measured cadence of another. In binding himself to Ivy, he had found a place where his unmeasured could lean against the measured. It is one thing to understand, in the abstract, that sacrifices occur in love stories. It is another to know what exact lines on the skin will be the ledger of that sacrifice. Ivy looked at her hands, at the slender bone that registered sunlight differently now. She thought of her mother's face, and of her own insistence on autonomy. She thought of the civic causes that had given her purpose. And then, with the precision that had long served her in negotiations, she asked the question that mattered most. "Can it be undone?" she asked. He did not flinch. He had been waiting for the question like a man who had always kept certain contingencies catalogued. "There are ways to alter the arrangement," he conceded. "Ways to lessen it, to shift it, to bind it elsewhere. But each has consequence. My existence is not merely a quaint oddity. It is a fracture in the order that requires a remedy, if one wishes to close it. Releasing it entirely may not be possible without payment, and that payment is a price you must weigh." There was no melodrama in his pronouncement. There was only the offering of choice, raw and unvarnished. Ivy had been taught to choose with a ledger in mind. This was far more complicated than any ledger. It was not only years and not only lines. It was the currency of story, the way someone's arc bends because of another's presence. She slept poorly that night. The wind moved along the eaves like a conversation she was not privy to. When she touched her face, the new lines felt like evidence, and evidence demanded action. The next morning she woke to find a hair of silver at her temple, a single filament that seemed almost deliberate in its assertion. She looked at it the way an archaeologist might examine a new layer in a dig, underwhelmed by the spectacle of it, and urgent for understanding. If this were a simple drama, she might have left. But she had never been simple. She found instead that she was capable of holding contradiction in the same breath, loving a man and refusing to be consumed by him. She began to sketch the parameters of possibility with the precision of a strategist. She would not be passive. She would not accept consumption as the price for companionship without exploring every nuance, every alternative, even if those alternatives meant confessions she did not want to make public. There were practicalities she set in motion. Discreet consultations with physicians who specialized in rare conditions, though she insisted their language remained strictly medical, with no metaphors about hours or souls. Private conversations with legal counsel about the precise language of binding and contract form. Not because she believed legalese governed metaphysics, but because the act of formalizing choice steadied her. All the while, she and Alexander continued to inhabit the same small geography. Breakfasts that stretched into conversations about books he had read when she'd been learning polite listening. Evenings where they walked in silence with an intimacy she had never before allowed without reservation. It would be easy to depict these months as a slow erosion to melodrama. The woman who sacrifices herself and the inscrutable husband whose appetite consumes her. That would be false to the texture of what actually unfolded. Ivy chose with deliberation. When she chose, she did so not because she had been coaxed into surrender, but because she had weighed the meaning of her days and decided, moment by moment, whether to spend them in this ledgered arrangement or not. There were small mercies. Alexander, for all his otherness, was capable of tenderness in ways that bespoke a creature used to being apart from gestures. He learned which of Ivy's childhood songs made her laugh. What scent on a pillow soothed the specific tension between her shoulders. What silence meant that she needed space rather than presence. And when she grew afraid, and she did, in the brittle private way only the privileged can be when confronted with a loss that cash cannot repair, he did not evade. He admitted the reality of what binding meant, and that confession was itself an honor. The honeymoon, such as it was, became a laboratory where she measured herself against the tide. In public, they were the immaculate couple. On the press pages, they appeared as a consummate unit, a model of refined taste interrupting the ordinary course of celebrity. At night, behind heavy curtains, she kept watch on the slow changes. A friend who had visited commented, offhand, on how rested Ivy looked, which was both true and a small wrong. The new fatigue came in a different register, a slow accumulation of hours, a sensation as if some of the world's minutes were being measured twice. She made the single public promise that felt like a rope thrown into uncertain water. She would choose consciously. That admission to herself steadied the days like an oar. She was not a woman who let fate decide. If this life required sacrifice, she would choose the terms. The first unmistakable event occurred not in spectacle, but in a small private accident. One evening she caught her reflection in a bedroom mirror, and for a fraction of a breath, the woman who looked back had a small constellation of lines around her eyes she had not noticed before. They were gentle, almost dignified. She touched them and felt no pain. The humming she had heard that first morning sharpened into a thing she could now place under her ribs. It was not malevolent. It was an instrument. It measured, it marked, she told Alexander. He nodded. It will take, he said. It takes unevenly, like weather. You will have agency in how much you allow it to take, Ivy. But the tether, once engaged, will seek equilibrium. That word, equilibrium, was not subtle. It suggested a science she had no desire to perform, yet it also carried a moral center. Ivy could not forget that she had been given a choice. She had been bound, yes, but not coerced. That distinction felt vital. Her sense of agency bristled against the idea of passive loss. She wrote it down in a small book she kept of decisions, the kind of ledger used in households where heritage matters more than sentiment. List of pros, cons, mitigations. She annotated with dates and marginalia, and once, a scribbled line that said simply, "This is my life." She owned that line as if it were a signature. Then, and it felt like a small rupture and like the first bookend, Alexander's nature became unavoidably public. They had planned a modest reception for certain close friends in the city, a late-night gathering in a private club with windows that overlooked an arterial view. Ivy had been expecting the usual parade of compliments and the illicit gossip of those who believed in being impeccable in public and ruthless in private. Instead, at the precise moment when the band paused and someone called for a toast, the air in the room altered. Glasses tinkled and then chimed slightly out of tune. The candles on each table leaned as if in the same direction, and a thin cold shimmer ran up the center of each flame. It began with a sound people felt before they understood it, a low resonance that pulled at the fillings of teeth, a hum that had for months been the private tale of her days. Then the room experienced a slow, collective cold. People shivered. Someone laughed at first, thinking it an effect. Cameras, opportunist as ever, caught the exact beat the world shifted. Alexander stood beside Ivy and spoke, quietly enough not to be overheard, but with a clarity impossible to mistake. "There are things about me that do not fit into your frames," he said. "I have chosen her as a tether. That choice means her hours will be measured differently while we remain bound." The words, when carried past the threshold of private rooms into a public, social air, landed like a pebble into a silent pond. Conversation halted. Chairs scraped. Ivy felt the eyes like a new kind of light falling on her skin, both brilliant and invasive. Some faces reflected curiosity, some alarm. She could see in their mouths the knot of speculation that would last in society columns for months. Her mother, who had navigated 100 reputations, did not faint or call for lawyers. She steadied herself and, as if asking a question she had posed in the privacy of a study, said only, "Ivy." Ivy could have stopped him then. She could have said no in a dozen ways. She could have insisted they keep such matters within the privacy of their home. But there is a point at which secrecy becomes a kind of bondage of its own, and Ivy had never been comfortable living with things unspoken. She stood and met the room with a gaze she had practiced for scenarios far less intimate than this. "This is true," she said, and the sound of her voice was not small. "I knew what it could mean. I knew the risk. That does not mean it is simple. I will not be reduced to a curiosity." Her words did not calm the world, but they did something different. They named her as an agent. The choice remained hers. The crowd might chatter, the columns might speculate, but the locus of power, terrible and necessary, rested with her. After the reception, in a car that smelled faintly of leather, and later of cigarette smoke because the press did what it always did, Ivy looked at herself in the window and found that the reflection that returned her gaze was steadier than she felt. Alexander, beside her, watched the city spool by with a face that gave nothing away. He reached for her hand with a touch that was both possessive and reverent. That was when the small, insistent questions she had been postponing began to knit into a plan. Public knowledge changed things in a way that made negotiating with intimacy more urgent. It took the private calculus and turned it into an ethical debate that others felt compelled to weigh in on. Ivy did not like being the subject of conversation, as if she were a museum piece. She returned to the home in which she had practiced a life of considered choices, and began to construe a strategy that would preserve her dignity, while honoring the fact that she had not been coerced. She met with absorptions of experts without telling them what she had been told about the tether beyond the facts she could prove. She asked lawyers about the language of consent, as if consent could be litigated into permanence. She asked friends whether love, in any of its forms, justified partitioning off parts of one's life. Answers varied. Some offered support, some advice, some an uncomfortable silence. The real reckoning, she understood, had to be private. Back in the small evenings when companions were fewer and the candles burned more equitably, she and Alexander sat across from one another and spoke the things that mattered the most. He answered questions with a kind of dignity that hinted at old loneliness and revealed a weariness where a human face might show age. His was a fatigue of being outside the rhythm of days. He had seen centuries fold into themselves, observed empires of weathering from a distance, kept memory like a room with many windows but few doors. "I do not want to harm you," he said once, eyes unmoving. "If I could exist without taking, I would. But this is the shape of me." Ivy's response was not a scream at the injustice. It was a ledgered negotiation, a practical assessment of self. She asked for boundaries. She negotiated pauses. She insisted that any taking be done with ongoing consent, renewed and explicit, not a one-time act signed on a cliff. She framed her life in stipulations. Preserve her work, her charities. Do not let this tether isolate her from collaborators. Respect the transparency she needed to feel steady. He agreed, because he had wanted her from the beginning not as a commodity, but as a kind of refuge. He agreed because he knew the cost, in his own way, and the loneliness that an eternal being feels when denied reciprocation. He agreed because for someone like him, balance was a principle rather than a tactic. They were not, in those months, a simple couple. Their nights contained both tenderness and transactions. They shared laughter that surprised them both and silences where each retreated into private inventories of fear. Ivy, who had always measured herself by the efficacy of choices, began to learn how to be present with the knowledge that some choices exacted damage. The novelty of feeling both powerful and vulnerable was a lesson in humility. It never occurred to either of them that the story would not demand more of them than they could provide. They made plans. They agreed on certain terms. They lived for a time within the negotiated architecture. And life, which is neither tidy nor merciful, began to show its small consequences. One morning in the cottage, she opened a book to a planted passage and found, tucked between the pages, a single strand of hair that was not entirely her color. She did not know if she had placed it there in a previous mood of containment, or if some messenger had left it as a token. The ambiguity made her smile, and then made her frown. It was a small thing, almost comical, an artifact of two lives beginning to braid. But it was evidence, and evidence demanded cataloging. She kept a journal, in a hand that had learned to be tidy under pressure. She wrote dates beside small changes, a shade in the pattern of her skin, a new shadow under her eye, the way laughter folded differently. For Ivy, cataloging was not capitulation. It was an act of resistance. It allowed her to see that the changes, while inexorable, were not yet catastrophic. It allowed her to keep a ledger she could consult, so her future self could not claim she had been naive. There was, however, an event neither of them had planned for. It should have been an ordinary morning, a day of small appointments and a luncheon with colleagues organizing an endowment. Ivy was inspecting a mirror in which the chandelier arranged its light as if to flatter, when she noticed a small line at the corner of her left eye. A line sharper now, as if the clock had taken a fine cutting instrument to her reflection and left a mark. It was a physical thing, banal almost in its specificity, a line. But it arrived with a new quality. She could feel, with the strange sensitivity of a woman who had spent a life practicing composure, that an instrument outside her was marking her. She put her hand to her face and felt the hum. It was not external. It vibrated under her skin, as if some measuring device had been threaded through her days and was now running its finger over the hours. Ivy realized in a way that did not come with drama that the tether did not merely draw time. It measured and claimed it. She could live with that, she told herself. if it remained a measured consumption, and if she always retained choice. Choice. The word was a pocketed warmth she could fold and keep. She had chosen. She had consented. Consent, however, was not the end of negotiation. It was only one point on a spectrum of decisions she would have to make for the rest of her measured life. If you could pick one truth over a lifetime of comforts, which would you choose? Comment below. The rest of that day became a geography of decisions. Ivy moved through it with the practiced grace of someone who had always known how to make decisions in public. She called meetings she did not need to take, an advisor to push legal boundaries, a confidant to test the moral contours of disclosure, a doctor to note the physical change. She tried to live the ordinary pieces of a life she had built with earnestness. A phone call to a charity, a note to an old friend, a late afternoon spent reading. At night she and Alexander sat and spoke of contingencies, each conversation an exercise in honest arithmetic. The honeymoon had, for all of its pockets of tenderness, given way to the knowledge that their marriage had rearranged the map of her days. Ivy did not regret what she had done. Regret felt like surrender. Instead, she felt the tightened focus of someone about to steward a difficult project. There were moments of fury, too. Flashes where she wanted to rage at the universe for being so inelegant a landlord. But fury passed like weather. Determination remained. In the soft hours, when the world felt like a model and not a reality, Ivy allowed herself images of the future unbound. She imagined old age worn like a medal, lines deepening on a face that had been lived in rather than stolen away. She entertained the idea, quiet and absurd, that aging itself might be a kind of redemption, a map of a life rather than a ledger of loss. Those thoughts were her rebellion. Then, one night while the rain stitched the cottage's windows with sound, the tether announced itself in a different register. It began not as a visual change, but as a sensation of acceleration. Minutes folded into other minutes, small notches of time stacking as if someone were turning pages too quickly in a book one treasured. Ivy felt it physically, a laugh that took a moment to go from throat to mouth, a finger that for a beat seemed to move through syrup. She had the unaccountable sense that a shadow of herself had been drafted into service elsewhere, that a parallel measure of her had been borrowed for some outside economy. She did not panic. She had rehearsed responses. She had written contingencies on crisp paper. She called Alexander into the room and watched his face, which registered a sad pleasure at her alertness, and a trace of guilt that made something in her want to both forgive and hold him accountable. "We could reverse it, perhaps," he said tentatively. "There are ways to unbind. They are costly." Costly. The word had become the texture of their lives. It wrapped around decisions like a ribbon. Ivy felt the truth of it in the bones of her. She also felt, with an almost dizzying clarity, that whatever came next would not be a decision made by others. It would be hers. The path forward would be chosen by a woman who had learned to perform control and had also learned to hold tenderness. She settled into that knowledge with an odd serenity. She was not certain she could bear all that might be asked of her. She was not certain she would make the right choice, but for the first time in years she welcomed an uncertain future so long as it was a future she had chosen. Outside, the rain eased. Inside, the house held two people who had entered a covenant neither had fully anticipated, and who now stood at the beginning of a longer story. It was a story that would ask of Ivy the kind of bravery that had nothing to do with red carpets or headlines. It was the quiet, private courage of a woman who would have to reconcile her hunger for agency with the peculiar cost of loving something that did not, by its nature, fit into ordinary frames. She did not yet know when or how the tether might demand a final accounting. She only knew that the next chapters would be written in the small ledger of days, each line an act of will. For now, she would keep the book close, she would count the changes, and she would keep choosing. At dawn, on the third morning after that rain, Ivy stood by the window and watched the outline of the world sharpen into daylight. The chandelier scattered morning into the room in a familiar geometry. She put a hand on the glass and felt the faint vibration come through. The sound she had learned to name, the tether's song. And for a moment she wondered what it meant to offer a life willingly. She had offered it, and the offering had been accepted. Now the work began. The decision, when it came, was both exacting and inevitable. Ivy found she could no longer live with the ledger open in the small hours, tallying the slow theft of herself in marginalia and dates. Choice had been her accustomed refuge. Now it felt like the only sanctified work left to do. She began to make arrangements as if planning a final fund, careful, necessary, unromantic in its precision. There were letters to compose, some practical, some intimate, addresses to confirm, endowments to secure so that what she loved would not falter because she had elected to disentangle herself from a balance it had subsidized. She wrote not to plead, but to make sure that no one could later say she had left things sloppy. Alexander met her, as he always had, in the geometry of stillness. He watched her assemble this architecture of leaving with a kind of suffering that was almost courteous. He would have preferred ease, whatever kind that was possible within a being who had long ago learned to prefer none. When she told him, finally, sitting at the table with the winter light coming thin through the cottage panes, she did so in a voice that had the same steady cadences as her decisions. "I will release you," she said. "I will unbind you." He did not attempt to dissuade her with promises of softer mitigations. He had been candid from the outset. His honesty had been one of the things that, paradoxically, made her trust him. For a moment he was simply an old thing looking on, a being who had lived heretofore in the margins of calendar and weather, and now watched a choice she had made. "If you choose this," he said carefully, "understand the consequence." She did. Ivy had documented them down to nuance. She had imagined the pain, the lines on her face, the hours that might condense and collapse into a single passage. She had imagined friends who would not forgive the choice, and the faces of strangers who would make art of her courage or her foolishness. She had imagined, too, the rare possibility that the fracture might close and leave both of them altered in ways neither could anticipate. She had, in the end, no interest in a life whose best parts were borrowed. She wanted the brutality of truth, even if it cost her the prettier illusions. "Then I choose," she said. They did not manufacture a ritual, because the world had taught Ivy to despise theatricality dressed as meaning. Instead, they made a small sequence of gestures that mattered to them. Candles set in a ring on the cottage's flagstones, a single chair left empty for no reason but to mark absence, 2 flasks of water, 1 for each, and a thin ribbon that had been used once to tie the box with her father's cufflinks, now cut and unrolled until it stretched like a suggestion. She took the ribbon and tied it once around her wrist as if to mark the moment, but then let it fall loose, because she wanted the release to be a matter of speech rather than ornament. They walked to the cliff where the proposal had been made, the place where the Atlantic threw itself against stone, and the weather loved to perform extremes. The landscape remembered them, the wind pinned to the same memory, the gulls indifferent, as if nature kept a ledger of appointments and returned to them on demand. Ivy liked that symmetry. It felt less like a finale than a necessary punctuation. No one else came. She refused aids and witnesses. She wanted the act to be pure to what it was, her choice and its consequence. Alexander said nothing that could stand between them. His hands were like 2 things that had learned to hold without grasping too tightly. For the first time since their first meeting, he looked vulnerable in a way she had not known he could be. Not wounded, exactly, but exposed to the gravity of being chosen to be freed. When she began, the language was ordinary. She did not reach for ancient syllables or conjurations. She spoke in the simple idiom she used for others, brief, precise, true. "I release you," she said slowly. The air took the phrase and made something of it. The first sensation was the hum, low and familiar, a tuning that had lodged itself inside her since Zurich. It shifted and grew like an instrument aligning until its note matched some interior key. The candles that ringed them did not blow out, but their flame thinned into a silver that made the air look as if it had been lightly dusted with frost. Ivy felt a pressure along her skin, a tracer route along the bones, as if someone had run a soft wire beneath the surface of the day and were tugging it for attention. She said it again. "I release you." With each repetition, the line between them thinned. Where earlier the tether had been a murmur that threaded her days, now it took on a shape she could apprehend, not in schematic detail, but in pure sensation. A slender strand of light that arced from his sternum to her clavicle and pulsed like a compromise. It was not pretty. It was not save you in a triumphant movie beat heroic. It was an honest thing, A piece of being wound through another. Pain came then. A clean, bright pain that did not smear into hysterics, but leaned like a hand on the center of her chest. Time took a curious course. For an instant the sun took a longer orbit. Her breath met her as if through a narrow throat. Ivy felt, almost ecstatically, the ledger she had kept come alive. Years' worth of tiny notations rushed through her in a single, corrugated wave. Laughter at a luncheon, a child's first drawing in a frame she kept. The smell of old books at midnight. 100 small kindnesses she had thought trivial. Each memory struck like a toll. With each toll a small change took hold at the temple, at the mouth, at the line that ran from ear to cheek. "I release you," she repeated, and the words slipped into a cadence, an incantation of agency. It was not a surrender to fate. It was an act of giving that required brute strength. Alexander watched her with eyes that looked, Ivy would swear this later, larger than storm gray, as if the weather within them had somehow softened. He reached for her hand with a tenderness that made her need to hold him and let him go at the same time. "You do not have to," he began, and then stopped, "because there are things that must be prevented by one's own hand rather than another's counsel." "You are not a thing to be kept in a cabinet of curiosities," she said, voice thining with the pain and the gratitude strangely braided in it. "And I will not be a ledger entry." The strand trembled. The humming shifted into a kind of unpinned chorus. For Ivy the sensation condensed, a pressure behind the eyes that felt like a clockwork unthreading. Lines etched themselves with a speed that was breathtaking. They mapped themselves to stories in her head that she had already written and now watched blossom on skin. Where there had been a single silk hair of silver, now a faint array claimed her temple. Her fingers, when she looked at them, showed the fine topography of years in a moment. It did not feel like annihilation. It felt like payment. Alexander leaned forward, closing the distance that had always kept him slightly apart. He pressed his forehead to hers, a gesture she had, in other worlds, seen as yielding. She felt then the temperature of his skin cool and then, improbably, warm with the pressure. There was, in that warmth, a humanizing friction she had not before observed. Tears that had no words for shame or victory slid down her cheeks, and she let them, because she had never let herself be small in such a clear way. The air compressed. The frost on the grass was now a sheen, as if the world bore witness to the cost. Ivy repeated the words once more, and then a final time, with a clarity that meant every syllable. "I release you." The strand shivered until it became a filament, and then it sprang. Not with an explosive dramatization, but with the finite, irretrievable clarity of a snapped cord. There was a sensation as if the room had inhaled, and then denied itself exhalation. The humming dropped out, and for an instant, a silence, clear as a bell, dominated everything. Alexander's outline did not instantly dissolve, nor did he fall. He simply was not there in the way he had been. Where he had stood a moment before, there was, for an instant, a suggestion of light like fumes curling up and away. Ivy staggered back against the stone and felt the bouquet of her life settle into a new arrangement. The pain peaked, and then, in a manner that felt merciful in its economy, ebbed. She was left with a fatigue that was more ancient than tiredness, a knowledge lodged in the marrow that she had paid and that payment had altered her. When she could look again, Alexander was gone. He did not die in a spectacle. He did not vanish in triumph or in smoke. He had ceased to be tethered in that particular way. Whatever he had been, fracture, anomaly, otherness, had withdrawn like a tide. Ivy had expected many things, but she had not expected grief so immediate and precise. She mourned not only the loss of him in his earlier, uncanny form, but the shape of a possibility. A life that could have been different had the economy of being been more generous. She returned to the cottage where the wind had been less circuitous than before, and slept in a way that senselessly made her feel whole and broken at once. Days passed with a practical sequence of recovery. Calls to forge legal documents that no longer had anything to govern but whose formation felt necessary. Arrangements to sew up some part of her life, so others would not be left to guess whether her decision had been rash. The public would have much to say. Ivy expected columns and condolences, and the perfunctory thrill of scandal turned moral lesson. She found, to her surprise, that she was less interested in what strangers said than in the quiet accumulation of her own days. Weeks became months. The lines that had appeared on her face settled into a dignified geography. People told her she looked distinguished and meant both it and the pity beneath it. She continued the work she had always loved. She found a new intensity in those hours. Where once she had worried that her days might be measured out against another's needs, she now inhabited time in a way that felt richer. Every morning had an edge, yes, but it was the edge of genuine possession rather than borrowed lease. There were nights when she expected him to return, when the cliff breeze seemed to carry a voice, or when a reflection in a window held a storm gray that she almost recognized. There were days when the ledger felt heavier, and others when it felt like ballast. She would sometimes thumb through the small journal she had kept and read the pages where she had tracked the tether like an accountant reads a ledger to understand an error. She never regretted the action. Regret felt like erasure. Gratitude felt like memory. Years unspooled in honest increments. Ivy aged in a way that belonged to the world she had helped construct, with purpose and the patina of service. Her hair silvered entirely in time. Her hands bore the map of decades of work, of activism, of moments where she declined spectacle for effect. She built new patterns of intimacy with friends and the women she mentored. Those who had once seen her as an icon and now saw her as an elder with a steady voice. She taught young philanthropists how to commit to long, slow wins instead of headlines. She ran the foundation with a rigor that left no doubt as to how she had used the hours she had protected. And then, after a life of living and loss and small reprieves, decades rolled into a quiet winter in which the world felt smaller, not because it had shrunk, but because she had chosen to notice less of its spectacle and more of its substance. She had been present at some funerals, some weddings, some openings of buildings that bore the names of those she loved. She had learned the dignity of being ordinary, while extraordinary expectations clung like moth-winged dust to the edges of her reputation. It was on such an afternoon, in a hospital room that smelled faintly of lemon and old paper, that he returned. She was there for a friend's brief convalescence, a woman who had once worked on a campaign Ivy had funded, and she sat by the window watching the light tilt in a way that made the dust look like golden pollen. The bell jangled outside the corridor, and a man appeared who, at a distance, had the wrong posture for the apartment where Ivy had once given parties. He walked with a certain hesitancy, and with a bundle in his hands as if he had taken long to learn how to carry human burdens. Ivy did not stand up at once. She let the gaze come the way an elder lets a weathered ship come into a harbor, with time and an attention that was not to rush. When he reached the doorway, their eyes met. The eyes were not storm gray in the way she remembered them. Color had shifted. They still held the weather. There was a residue of seasons, but there was also the glint of a brittle human clarity. Lines veined his face. His hair had silvered at the temples. He moved with a slow, steady breath that suggested a pulse measured by muscles rather than by enigmas. He held himself in a way that was unmistakable to her. He had been someone who knew how to be exact in presence. Alexander glanced at the woman in the bed, nodded, and then looked back at Ivy as if to ask permission to step further into the room already occupied by years and memories. Ivy rose then, the way one rises for an old friend or an old debt, and when he reached her she saw the extraordinary ordinariness of him, a man whose otherness had washed away with the tide and left, improbably, something new. He smiled, and it was neither the reserved architecture of the man who had enchanted Zurich nor the inhuman cool of the earlier months. It was tentative in a way that made both of them look like strangers and intimates at once. "You came back," she said simply. He folded his hands as if to keep something from trembling. "I do not know what else to be," he said. "I do know I have had to learn how to measure single hours. I have had to learn the ache and the gift of hunger, of sleep that truly ends, of being small in the face of winters. It is hard. It is true. And it is not what I expected." Ivy looked at him and felt, in that brief sequence, the arc of choices that had bent them both toward this room. There was so much to say. Apologies, forgivenesses, explanations that would smell of selfishness. But she surprised herself by answering with a simplicity she had not always afforded herself. "You are here," she said. "That is enough for now." They sat side by side near the bed, and for a while neither tried to map the time that had passed. Conversation flowed like a slow current. Small acknowledgments, sentences that admitted to learning how to be human again. Confessions of loneliness in forms that were comprehensible now because they were concrete. He told her of the odd years when he had been neither this nor that. When he had drifted in places where memory was too wide and time too shallow. She told him how she had filled her days with making sure others' hours were not wasted. He listened, properly listening, in the way that had once made her surrender confidences as if he were safe. She forgave him privately, and then, in a larger, more public way, she accepted that his return carried its own immensity. She had released him. That act had demanded everything it had asked for. Now, a life had been fashioned out of unglamorous practice and daily smallness. They did not pretend that the world had given them a story with simplistic closure. He had debts to reckon that had nothing to do with bills. The simple education of being mortal again, the pain of relearning appetite and fatigue, and the way seasons cut the skin. Ivy, who had aged honestly and without theatrics, had circles and scars no cosmetic would call a flaw. They both knew there would be no tidy resurrection of youth, no easy undoing of the ledger. There was instead a slow, careful reassembling of something that might be called companionship, if only to avoid calling it something grander before it had a chance to grow plain. Months followed that room in which they spoke. Alexander found in the smallness of a daily routine the human rhythms that had long ago been allegory to him. He learned to carry a kettle without overfilling it, to let sleep arrive without waking into oddness, to find joy in fruit that bruised and in laughter that came from surprise rather than calculation. Ivy, for all her steadiness, discovered new dimensions of softness and surprise. How someone who had been an other could, in time, become a partner in the dignified business of aging. They did not return to the penthouse's grand entertainments. Instead, they built evenings of quiet. A modest apartment with windows that caught late light, a table that bore food and a few books, a lamp they could both read under. Ivy found, in the routine of sharing a cup of tea, the kind of presence that had nothing to do with spectacle, and everything to do with truth. Alexander learned how to look at himself in a mirror, and see not a rupture, but a man who bore the marks of a strange life and the fragile prize of a human heartbeat. There were times when regret brushed the surface of their days. No one is unscarred by choices that cost so much, but these were tempered by the humility that comes from choosing fiercely and living with the consequence. Ivy never repeated the ledger publicly. She had no desire for her decision to be media fodder. It remained instead a private geometry between them, an account settled by will and, in the end, softened by time. On certain nights, when the wind remembered the cliff and the chandelier light in the penthouse seemed like a relic of another life, they sat near a window and watched the city be itself, luminous and indifferent. Ivy would touch the line at her temple, now a smooth ridge like a shoreline, and Alexander would watch the way she did this, and both would smile at the small, unremarkable ways comfort intruded on the magnificence of their history. When Ivy's hand finally slowed in its steady work, years folding into decades with the slow grace of a well-tended garden, she was not a tragic figure, nor an icon. She was a woman who had chosen, sometimes harshly, and who had made room for sorrow and surprising joy. At her side, Alexander was a man who had learned to measure his hours and who felt gratitude as a muscle, not a sentiment. The last afternoons of her life were neither cinematic nor profound beyond their intimacy. They were made of visits from other women she had mentored, letters that arrived with the polite weight of people who had been changed, small dinners with bread and butter and the soft conversation of those who had not much left to prove. Alexander fed her the same way he once had learned which of her childhood songs made her laugh, with focused attention and a tenderness that had been honed in the mundane. On a cold morning, as winter arranged itself with an economy of frost across the panes, Ivy sat in the apartment's best chair and let the light sit on her hands. Alexander knelt to adjust a shawl around her shoulders, his fingers finding the familiar path of years. She looked at him then, with all the measured appreciation a life of decisions can bring, and said, with a voice that had the sediment of decades, "You became human, in the way that matters." He smiled, and it was a simple thing. No thunderclap, no miraculous announcement. "You made me so," he said. "You released me, and in releasing me, you gave me back what I could not have taken." She considered that, and in the quiet of the room felt the truth of it. That freeing another is its own kind of alchemy, sometimes costly, sometimes terrible, sometimes luminous. She had paid with time and lines on skin. She had been given other things in return. A life she had owned, a capacity to love without ledger, a peace that was not easy but was steady. When her breath thinned and the light softened as it does at the edge of a day, Alexander stayed. No theatrics, no words of impossible comfort. He simply held her hand, feeling the pulse, a real, patient pulse, and she, with the final clarity that lives visit upon us, smiled. "If this story moved you," she might have said in some other world, with a voice that could be broadcast like an announcement, "remember there are costs to choosing, and costs to refusing. Choose." If this story moved you, if you've been carried by Ivy's choices and the strange gift of Alexander's return, subscribe for more tales where love asks for something difficult, and sometimes what we surrender grows into mercy.